The wind off the Rocky Mountains cut through wool and skin alike, a knife of winter slicing across the frozen plains of Montana. Dawn had barely begun to breathe color into the horizon when the train came grinding to a halt outside Helena. The metal shrieked, the air hissed with steam, and a dozen weary faces pressed against the frosted glass of the prisoner cars. Antonio Ricci could see his breath bloom in front of him as he peered through the tiny barred window. The world outside was white, not the chalky dust of North Africa where he had been captured, but a blinding, endless whiteness that seemed to swallow the earth. Snow lay thick over the rails, over the skeletal trees, over the roofs of barns that leaned against the wind like tired men. He thought, for a moment, that perhaps this was a trick, that the Americans had brought them to the edge of the world to vanish quietly into the cold. The doors clanked open. "All right, fellas, off the train. Line up," a voice shouted in English. The tone wasn't harsh, but the men froze anyway, hands stiff at their sides. They had heard too many stories, rumors whispered in desert camps passed from prisoner to prisoner like smuggled contraband. Americans, they said, hated Italians more than Germans. Americans shot prisoners for sport, starved them, used them as slaves. Every step Antonio took onto the frozen platform felt like the beginning of that nightmare. But when his boots met the ground, it wasn't blood or ice that greeted him. It was coffee. Somewhere nearby, someone had brewed coffee strong enough to perfume the air. A soldier walked down the line, not barking orders but counting softly, his breath steaming in front of him. He wore a thick coat and a knitted scarf, and when he reached the end of the line, he said something in English that Antonio couldn't catch. Then he smiled, and nodded toward a line of trucks idling by the station. "Move along, amici," another guard said, his accent heavy, almost musical. He wasn't American. "Montana," he added, pointing to the trucks. "Work, not war." Antonio exchanged a glance with the man beside him, a baker from Turin named Carlo. Work, not war. The words sounded like a lie too kind to believe. The prisoners climbed into the backs of the trucks, the wooden slats cold against their fingers. The engines coughed to life, and soon they were rolling out into the white expanse. Snowflakes clung to their hair, melted on their lips. Through the gaps in the boards, Antonio saw a world so wide it hurt to look at. Hills rolled into valleys and disappeared beneath blankets of snow. Fences ran for miles, marking nothing but space. Occasionally they passed a small farmhouse, smoke curling from a chimney, and children who waved as the convoy went by. Children waving at prisoners. He couldn't make sense of it. By mid-morning, the trucks pulled into a cluster of low wooden buildings surrounded by a tall wire fence. Hand-painted sign stood by the gate. Camp Rimini. Beneath it, a small flag flapped in the wind, the stars and stripes, its colors muted by frost. Guards stood at the entrance, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, faces red from the cold. There were no snarling dogs, no barking officers, just the crunch of boots on snow and the quiet murmur of voices. When the prisoners climbed down, an American officer met them with a clipboard. He was tall, with a square jaw and a calm expression that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. "Welcome to Montana," he said slowly, enunciating each word as if speaking to a classroom. "You work, you eat, you cause trouble, you freeze. Simple enough." No one answered. The translator repeated the sentence in Italian, and a few men nodded hesitantly. The officer gestured toward the barracks. "Get them settled. Chow at noon." Inside, the barracks smelled of pine wood and coal smoke. The beds, real beds, were lined with wool blankets. There were stoves in the corners, already burning. Someone had left tin mugs and a pot of steaming water on a table. Antonio stood in the doorway, stunned. This was not a prison. It was rough, yes, but it was clean, warm, alive. Carlo muttered under his breath, "They are mocking us. Tomorrow they will start the beatings." Antonio didn't answer. He ran his hand along the edge of a bunk, feeling the coarse fabric. It was the first warmth he had known since capture. That night, the wind howled across the plains like a living thing. The men lay in their bunks, eyes open, listening to the creak of the wooden walls. Someone near the stove began to hum a Neapolitan tune, soft and broken. Others joined in, a low murmur that filled the dark like prayer. When Antonio finally slept, he dreamed not of home, but of coffee and snow. Morning came sharp and silver. The guards called them outside, handing out gloves and heavy coats. The prisoners expected shovels for digging trenches or picks for breaking rocks. Instead, they were led to a large open field where a dozen American civilians stood waiting, ranchers by the look of them. Their coats were patched, their hands rough, but their faces were open, curious rather than cruel. One man stepped forward, his hat pulled low over his brow. "Name's Tom Harper," he said, tapping his chest. "This here's my place. You boys are going to help me mend fences and feed the stock. You do good work. I pay you in canteen money. You work lazy, you don't eat steak. Fair enough?" The translator relayed the message, and a ripple of disbelief moved through the group. Steak? Payment? The absurdity of it made Antonio laugh under his breath. Harper pointed toward the barns. "Let's get you started. Fence wire doesn't fix itself." The day's work began clumsy. The Italians, still wary, handled tools as if they were weapons. The snow was knee-deep in places, the wind cutting through their borrowed coats. But soon, muscle memory took over. Antonio had grown up in the hills outside Naples, hauling stone for his father's workshop. His hands knew labor. By noon, his breath came out in heavy clouds, his back ached, and for the first time in months, he felt alive. When the break came, the Americans passed out coffee and sandwiches. One of the ranchers, a woman with auburn hair tucked under a scarf, handed Antonio a cup. "Careful," she said with a smile. "It's hot." He didn't understand the words, but her tone was kind. The steam curled into his face, and he swallowed the drink in grateful silence. The flavor was bitter, smoky, strange. It tasted like a language he didn't yet know but wanted to learn. At sundown, they trudged back to camp, boots heavy with mud and snow. A sergeant at the gate nodded as they passed. "Good day's work, boys." Inside, dinner waited, beef stew thick with potatoes, bread still warm from the oven. The men ate like wolves. When the translator told them they would receive small credits for their labor, money to buy cigarettes or soap, Carlo laughed outright. "In Africa, they took our boots. Here, they pay us to eat." But that night, after the meal, the strangest part came. The guards gathered the prisoners outside the mess hall, stamping their feet in the snow. A truck arrived, its bed piled with crates. From the cab climbed a woman in a wool coat carrying a fiddle case. Antonio frowned. "A fiddle?" "Evening, fellas," she called out, her voice bright against the cold. "We're throwing a little get-together tonight at the hall, locals and all. You boys are invited." The translator hesitated before repeating it in Italian. The words made no sense. "Invited? To what?" The woman grinned. "We'll get you warmed up before the dance tonight." A murmur ran through the line of prisoners. A dance? Some thought it was a joke. Others crossed themselves, convinced it was a test. But the Americans seemed perfectly serious. They started unloading boxes, lanterns, tables, instruments. From inside the hall came the twang of a guitar tuning, the thump of boots on wood. Antonio turned to Carlo. "Dance?" Carlo shrugged. "Perhaps after the work they will make us perform for their amusement." But when the doors opened and the warmth of the hall spilled into the snow, it was nothing like mockery. Inside, ranch families gathered around long tables. Children darted between chairs. Soldiers leaned against the walls, laughing softly. The air was filled with the smell of cider and tobacco. An American man in a checkered shirt waved them in. "Come on, boys. Ain't nobody gonna bite." They hesitated only a moment before stepping through the doorway. The heat hit them first, then the light. Lanterns swung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the crowd. On the small stage, a band struck up a lively tune: fiddle, guitar, harmonica. Antonio stood at the edge of the room, stunned. These people were not conquerors. They were farmers, ranchers, neighbors, and they were smiling at the prisoners as though they were guests. The woman with the fiddle began to play, the bow dancing across the strings. The music was fast, joyful, impossible to resist. Someone clapped in time, and soon the room was a blur of motion, boots stomping, skirts twirling. A man shouted something Antonio didn't understand, but it made everyone laugh. Then a hand touched his shoulder. It was the auburn-haired woman from the ranch. She smiled, gesturing to the floor. Come on, dance. Antonio froze. He shook his head. No, no, I cannot. She tilted her head, amused. Sure you can. Before he could protest, she took his hand and led him forward. The crowd made room. The band shifted into a slower rhythm, the beat pulsing like a heartbeat. She placed his hand on her shoulder, her eyes kind but firm. Just follow the steps. It was clumsy at first. He moved left when she moved right. The others laughed, not cruelly but kindly, and soon the laughter became part of the rhythm. The floor shook with the stomp of boots, the air thick with heat and music. For a few impossible minutes, Antonio forgot the fence, the guards, the war. He forgot Mussolini and desert battles and propaganda posters. There was only the sound of fiddles, the glow of lanterns, and the dizzy warmth of being treated not as a prisoner, but as a man. When the song ended, applause filled the hall. The woman curtsied playfully and handed him a cup of cider. You did fine, she said. He took it with trembling hands. Grazie, he whispered. That night back in the barracks, the men spoke in low voices, disbelief woven through every word. Did you see how they smiled? They danced with us. They gave us cider. Antonio lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The music still echoed in his mind, the rhythm steady as his own heartbeat. He thought of home, of his mother hanging laundry in the sun, of the radio playing soft mandolin tunes on a Sunday afternoon. For the first time since his capture, the memories didn't hurt. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, work, snow, another dance, but he knew this much. The Americans were not the monsters he had been told to fear. They were something far stranger. They were kind. Outside, the wind carried faint notes of music from the hall, fading into the night. The snow fell softly against the barracks roof, muffling the world in silence. Antonio closed his eyes and smiled to himself. Maybe captivity wasn't the end of life. Maybe in this strange land of fences and fiddles, it was the beginning of understanding. When morning came, the guards blew their whistles, calling the men to roll call. The sky was pale gold, the air biting. Antonio stepped out into the snow, the cold shocking him awake. Across the yard, Tom Harper waved from his truck. "Come on, boys," he shouted. "Got a fence to fix before supper." As Antonio climbed into the truck bed, he heard laughter, real laughter, from his fellow prisoners. The fear that had gripped them for weeks was beginning to thaw, melting like ice under the Montana sun. The convoy rolled out through the gate, past the frost-covered sign that read, Camp Rimini. Beyond the wire, the world stretched open and endless. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills, the war still raged. But here, on this quiet morning, there was only work to be done, fences to mend, and perhaps, if they were lucky, another dance waiting at the end of the day. Antonio glanced at the sky, at the faint wisp of smoke rising from a distant farmhouse, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not even hope. Something deeper, quieter, respect. He didn't yet know it, but that feeling would change everything. The cold that morning was the kind that cut through bone, a dry, unrelenting chill that settled in the lungs and refused to leave. The sun had just begun to crest over the jagged ridges of the Rockies, painting the snowfields in soft gold. Steam rose from the backs of the horses tethered by the corral, their breath visible in the frigid air. The camp was quiet except for the creak of boots on frost and the rhythmic clang of the mess hall bell calling the prisoners to breakfast. Antonio Ricci tightened the buttons on his coat as he stepped outside. The sky above Camp Rimini stretched endless and pale, a bowl of frozen blue. The barracks behind him were lined neatly in rows, their chimneys coughing smoke into the morning wind. Around him, men shuffled toward the mess hall, Italians from Naples, Sicily, Turin, faces red from the cold, boots scuffing through snow. No one spoke much anymore. The cold made conversation a luxury. The coffee waiting inside wasn't quite what they drank back home. It was thinner, bitter, but it was hot. And in Montana, that was a kind of miracle. The stew that followed was heavy with beans and potatoes, and the bread came fresh every morning, baked by a small group of prisoners who had convinced the camp guards that Italians simply couldn't live without good bread. The guards, amused, had given them a corner of the kitchen, and the arrangement had worked ever since. That morning, as Antonio sat by the stove, warming his hands over the rising heat, he thought of home. In Naples, the sea breeze carried salt and sun, not the bite of frozen air. He remembered his mother's voice, soft and lilting, calling him in for supper. But those memories were faint now, ghosts blurred by distance and frost. "Ricci," a voice called from the doorway. It was Tom Harper, the rancher with the wide-brimmed hat and the permanent squint of a man who spent his life staring into sunlight. "You and your boys ready?" Antonio looked up, startled. Harper didn't speak much Italian, but he made himself understood through gestures, tone, and a strange sort of good humor that needed no translation. "Ready?" Antonio said, his accent thick. "Good. We got fence lines to check up by the creek. Bring Carlo, and maybe that tall fella. What's his name? Giorgio. Yeah, him too." The group gathered their tools and followed Harper out of camp. The guard at the gate waved lazily as they passed, his rifle slung over one shoulder. It was the same every day now. No barking orders, no counting heads. The Americans trusted them to work and come back, and they always did. The truck rumbled down a dirt road half buried in snow. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks glowing pink in the morning light. To the south lay fields where cattle moved slowly, their hides steaming in the cold. Antonio couldn't help but stare. Back home, farms were small, cramped between stone walls. Here, the land went on forever. When they reached the creek, Harper handed out gloves and wire. "Gotta fix that section before the wind tears it down again," he said. "Cows'll walk right through it otherwise." The work was hard, but it was clean. Antonio found comfort in the rhythm of it, the hammering of posts, the pull of wire, the crunch of snow under boots. The Americans worked beside them, not above them, and that simple fact baffled him. He had been raised to believe that power was something distant and loud, something enforced through rank and uniform. But here, on this frozen field, power was quiet. It looked like a man with cracked hands, working shoulder to shoulder with the people he commanded. When noon came, they stopped for lunch. Harper's wife, Evelyn, had packed sandwiches wrapped in paper, thick slices of bread filled with beef and mustard. She'd written names on each in pencil, though none of the prisoners could read English. Harper passed them out anyway. "My wife says you boys don't eat enough," he said, grinning. Antonio took his sandwich, his fingers stiff from the cold. The bread was warm against his palms. He didn't understand how, but somehow Evelyn had managed to bake warmth into food. As they ate, Harper lit a cigarette and looked out over the valley. "You know," he said, gesturing toward the horizon, "this land'll freeze you if you let it. Gotta keep moving, that's the trick." Antonio nodded, pretending to understand, though the man's words carried more meaning than translation could hold. By late afternoon, the fence was mended, the sun dipping behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and violet. They loaded the tools back onto the truck, the day's work done. Harper patted Antonio on the shoulder. "Not bad for city boys," he said with a wink. Back at camp, the men warmed themselves by the stove, their clothes stiff with frost. Someone started humming an old Sicilian tune, slow, melancholy, and soon the others joined in. The guards didn't stop them. In fact, one of the Americans tapped his foot in rhythm, smiling softly. It was strange, this coexistence. Prisoners and captors, bound not by fear, but by routine. The Americans followed the Geneva rules with almost religious devotion. They paid for labor, offered mail service through the Red Cross, even provided English lessons twice a week. Most of the Italians ignored the classes at first, but Antonio found himself drawn to them. He wanted to understand the words he heard every day, the jokes, the music, the kindness that lived between the sentences. It was during one of those classes that Evelyn Harper appeared at the camp for the first time. She stood at the back of the mess hall, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her smile bright enough to warm the room. "Afternoon, boys," she said, clutching a basket. "Brought you something to sweeten the day." Inside were small cakes, golden and sugared. She handed them out one by one, laughing as the men tried to thank her in broken English. When she reached Antonio, she paused. "You're the one Tom keeps talking about," she said kindly. "The mason," he blinked. "Mason?" She nodded, miming the act of laying bricks. "Stone, building. Tom says you're good." Antonio smiled, shy but proud. "Yes, build." She grinned. "Good." Maybe when the ground thaws, you can fix the chimney at the ranch. Tom's been promising to do it since the last war." The men laughed softly and she blushed. "Oh, and one more thing," she added. "We're having a barn dance this Saturday. Music, food, all that good stuff. The colonel says you boys can come. Supervised, of course. Think of it as a morale thing." The word dance rippled through the room like a gust of wind. The Italians exchanged bewildered glances. Surely she was joking. A dance? For prisoners? Evelyn only smiled wider. "Don't worry, we'll teach you the steps." That night the barracks buzzed with talk. Some men were suspicious, others curious. Carlo swore it was a test. "They'll line us up and laugh at us," he said. "You'll see." But Antonio wasn't so sure. He remembered the way Evelyn had looked at them, not with pity, not with superiority, but with simple friendliness. "Maybe they just want music," he said quietly. "Maybe they're lonely too." When Saturday came, the sky was clear and bright, the air sharp with the scent of pine. The prisoners were given clean uniforms, wool coats brushed free of dust, and told to behave. The guards seemed almost as excited as the men. The barn stood at the edge of the Harper Ranch, its wooden doors thrown wide open. Lanterns hung from the rafters, and bales of hay formed makeshift seats along the walls. A band was tuning up in the corner, fiddle, banjo, guitar. The sound filled the air like laughter. Evelyn greeted them at the door, her dress simple but elegant, her hair pinned back. "Welcome, gentlemen," she said, the word gentleman landing softly, as though it had always belonged to them. Antonio stepped inside and froze. The warmth, the smell of food, the hum of voices, it all felt unreal. American soldiers stood beside local families, ranchers beside prisoners. Someone handed him a mug of cider. Children darted between legs, chasing a small brown dog. It was chaos and joy, and something dangerously close to peace. The band began to play. The rhythm was strange, full of turns and stomps. Evelyn clapped her hands. "All right, boys," she called, "we're starting easy. This one's called a square dance. Watch the steps, follow your partner, and for heaven's sake, don't fall over each other." Laughter rippled through the crowd. A cowboy called out the steps in a voice loud enough to shake the rafters. "Bow to your partner! Swing her round!" At first, it was a mess. The Italians stumbled, collided, and tripped over their own feet. The locals tried to help, shouting instructions through laughter. "No, the other left! Turn her once, not twice!" Antonio, paired again with Evelyn, concentrated hard. Her hands were sure, her movements graceful. "1, 2, 3, turn," she said softly. "Good, Antonio, you're getting it." He wasn't, not really, but her encouragement was enough. His boots thudded against the floor, his heart pounding in rhythm with the fiddle. Around him, the room was alive with motion, soldiers, ranchers, prisoners, all spinning under the same strings of light. When the song ended, everyone cheered. Someone shouted for an encore. Evelyn laughed and wiped sweat from her brow. "You see," she said to Antonio, "not so terrible." He shook his head, grinning. "Terrible? No. Beautiful." Outside, the night was cold, the stars sharp against the sky. A few prisoners lingered near the barn doors, smoking and laughing softly. One of the guards, a young corporal named Davis, handed out cigarettes. "You boys dance better than half my platoon," he said, shaking his head. Carlo took a long drag and exhaled. "Maybe war is stupid," he muttered. "We should just dance instead." Davis chuckled. "Now that's a plan I could get behind." As the night wore on, the music softened into slower tunes. The laughter gave way to conversation. Antonio found himself sitting beside Harper near the fire pit, both men staring into the flames. "You miss home?" Harper asked quietly. Antonio hesitated. "Si. Always." "Yeah," Harper said. "Figured. I was overseas last war, in France. Missed home every damn day. Never thought I'd be the one feeding prisoners 20 years later." He tossed a stick into the fire, sparks flying. "Funny world, ain't it?" Antonio nodded slowly. "Funny, but good." When the night finally ended, the prisoners climbed back into the trucks. As they rode toward camp, the glow of the barn faded behind them, replaced by the vast silence of the plains. The cold crept back in, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt alive. In the barracks, the men talked long. After lights out, they spoke of the music, the laughter, the strange way Americans treated them not as enemies but as neighbors. Someone hummed the melody from the dance, and soon others joined in, their voices soft and warm against the cold walls. Antonio lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Evelyn's laughter, of Harper's quiet wisdom, of the way the barn lights had looked against the snow. In his heart, something had shifted. The world was still at war, but here, in this frozen corner of Montana, the battle lines were blurring. The next morning, the camp woke to the sound of horses. The guards were calling for work crews again, but this time the men rose eagerly. The fear that had once ruled every movement had been replaced by something new, a sense of belonging, however temporary. As Antonio stepped outside, the sun broke over the horizon, turning the snow to gold. Harper's truck waited by the gate, engine running, steam rising from the exhaust. "Morning, boys," Harper called. "Got a full day ahead. Let's move." Antonio climbed aboard, his hands already raw from cold, but his heart unexpectedly light. The road stretched out before them, winding between fields of white. Somewhere in the distance, a ranch radio played a faint tune, the same fiddle song from the dance. Antonio smiled. The music of a strange country had found its way into his bones. He didn't know it yet, but those melodies, those moments of laughter and work, were carving themselves into memory. Years later, when the war was long over and he was home again, he would remember not the battles, not the fear, but the cold Montana mornings and the sound of American fiddles calling him to dance. When the snow finally began to melt, it did not happen suddenly. It began with small sounds, the drip of water from the eaves, the groan of ice breaking loose from the creek, the soft squelch of boots sinking into half-thawed mud. Winter had kept its grip on Montana for too long, but now, at last, the world seemed to exhale. By spring, the fences stood firm, the cattle were fattening, and the Italians had become part of the rhythm of ranch life. What had once been a camp full of strangers had turned into a community that moved as one. The guards still walked the perimeter, rifles slung casually, but no one paid them much mind anymore. There had been no escape attempts, no fights, no reason for alarm. The men who had arrived terrified and defiant were now as much a part of the land as the snowmelt streams that ran through it. Antonio Ricci woke each morning before sunrise. The habit came naturally now. He would wash his face in the freezing water basin by the door, pull on his coat, and step outside just as the first light broke over the hills. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine sap. In the distance he could already hear the ranchers calling to their horses, the soft creak of saddle leather and the lowing of cattle. The camp's daily life had settled into a strange, peaceful order. After breakfast, work crews fanned out across the countryside. Some repaired fences or irrigation ditches, others helped deliver hay or clean barns. The men worked side by side with Americans, watched not by armed sentries, but by time and trust. Antonio had been assigned to the Harper Ranch permanently. What had begun as a practical decision, he was strong, good with tools, had grown into something more personal. Tom Harper trusted him. That trust had started small, first with shared tools, then with small errands. But one morning in April, Harper tossed him the reins of a wagon and said, "Take the team down to the lower pasture, check the gate. You can handle that on your own." Antonio blinked, uncertain he had understood. "Alone?" he asked. Harper nodded. "Alone." He spat into the dirt, then smiled. "You've been here long enough, son. Ain't no reason to watch a man who already works like he's free." The words hit harder than Antonio expected. Free. He repeated the word silently as he climbed onto the wagon. The horses snorted, their breath pluming in the cool air. For a moment, he hesitated, waiting for a guard to appear, for someone to shout an order. But no one did. He flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward, creaking along the dirt track toward the pastures. The hills opened before him, green now, dotted with the first wildflowers of the season. The sky stretched wider than he could comprehend. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time since his capture. No fences, no rifles, no shouted commands. Just wind and distance. Halfway down the road, he stopped the wagon and climbed down. The ground was soft under his boots, the smell of wet grass sharp and alive. He stood there, hands on his hips, and let the silence sink in. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. No one watched him. He could, if he wanted, keep walking. The mountains lay ahead, their peaks still capped with snow. He could vanish into them. But where would he go? He looked back toward the ranch, the barn roof shining in the sun, the faint movement of figures at work. That place, an American ranch in a foreign land, had become something unexpected. It was safety. It was purpose. It was, in a quiet way, home. He climbed back onto the wagon and turned the horses toward the valley. The realization settled in him slowly, like warmth after a long cold. Freedom was not just the absence of fences. It was being trusted enough to choose to return. That night, around the campfire, Antonio told Carlo and the others about the moment. The men listened in silence, the firelight flickering on their faces. When he finished, Carlo gave a small smile. "They're strange, these Americans," he said. "They make us prisoners and then treat us like neighbors." Antonio nodded. Maybe they know something we don't. As the months passed, the camp became less like a prison and more like a small town. There were mail deliveries from the Red Cross, carefully censored but cherished all the same. Packages arrived from home, tins of olive oil, small crosses, postcards stained by salt and distance. The Americans made sure every letter reached its owner, and sometimes the guards even helped read the ones written in difficult handwriting. The Geneva rules were followed to the letter. Inspectors came through every few weeks, men from Switzerland wearing armbands marked with red crosses. They walked the grounds, checked the kitchens, spoke privately with the prisoners. Every visit ended the same way, with polite nods and satisfied notes in their ledgers. The Americans treated their captives better than many treated their own workers. But the rules alone couldn't explain the shift that had taken place. It wasn't just law or order, it was something more human. The Montanans had grown to respect the Italians for their diligence, their humor, their songs. They worked hard, complained little, and brought a touch of warmth to even the coldest mornings. The evenings were the best. When the day's labor was done and the sky turned violet, the men would gather around the fire pits near the barracks. Someone would bring out a battered guitar, another a harmonica. At first, the songs were Italian, slow, wistful melodies from Naples and Sicily. Then, one night, an American cowboy joined in, his fiddle cutting through the air with sharp, joyful notes. The two sounds met and tangled, the soft sorrow of Italian folk music blending with the bold swing of American fiddle tunes. Before long, it became a ritual. The prisoners would sing of home, O Sol Mio, Santa Lucia, and the cowboys would answer with their own songs, Home on the Range, Red River Valley. The music built bridges faster than words ever could. Language mattered less than laughter, less than rhythm. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Harper leaned over to Antonio and said, "You know, I figure the whole damn world would be better off if we just sang together instead of shooting." Antonio smiled. "Maybe dance too." Harper chuckled. "Now that's an idea." A week later, that idea took shape. The Harpers announced another community gathering. This time, a full square dance open to everyone in the area, prisoners included. "Spring's here," Evelyn said with a grin as she pinned the notice to the camp bulletin board. "Time to shake off the frost and have some fun." The announcement caused a stir. Even the officers seemed uncertain whether it was proper, but the colonel in charge of Camp Rimini simply shrugged. "If it keeps everyone happy and out of trouble," he said, "let them dance." When the evening arrived, the barn glowed like a lantern in the twilight. Strings of bulbs hung from the rafters, casting warm circles of light on the wooden floor. The air buzzed with the smell of hay, coffee, and sweet tobacco. The Italians arrived in clean uniforms, their hair combed, boots polished as best they could manage. They looked less like prisoners than guests. The ranchers greeted them with nods and handshakes, the women with cautious smiles. The first awkward minutes passed in silence until the band struck up a tune, fast, bright, and impossible to ignore. "Form up!" shouted the caller, his voice booming. "Grab a partner! Don't be shy now!" Evelyn appeared beside Antonio, laughing. "You remember the steps, right?" He shook his head. "No, but I will try." She took his hand and pulled him into the circle. The dance began clumsily, boots slipping on the wooden floor, laughter echoing under the rafters. The Italians tried to mimic the steps, their movements stiff at first, but the music worked its magic. Soon they were turning, clapping, swinging, their faces flushed with effort and delight. "Do-si-do!" shouted the caller. "Promenade left!" The barn thundered with sound. Fiddle, banjo, the stomp of boots. Americans and Italians spun together, the boundaries between them dissolving like mist. Children cheered from the sidelines, guards clapped in time, and for a moment the war outside the barn simply ceased to exist. Antonio caught sight of Carlo laughing with a local girl, his face red from exertion. Across the room, Harper twirled Evelyn with surprising grace, his hat nearly flying off. The joy was contagious. The air seemed to vibrate with it. When the song ended, the applause was deafening. The band launched into another tune before the crowd could even catch its breath. This one was slower, almost tender. The dancers paired off again, swaying gently under the lights. Antonio looked around and realized what he was seeing was more than a celebration. It was proof that kindness could dismantle fear, that humanity could survive even in captivity. The same men who had once fought on opposite sides of a war were now moving together to the same rhythm. As the night deepened, the music softened into quiet melodies. People drifted outside to cool off under the stars. The sky was clear, vast, filled with constellations Antonio had never known. Evelyn joined him by the fence, handing him a cup of coffee. "You dance well for an Italian prisoner," she teased. He smiled, gazing at the stars. "And you dance well for a cowboy's wife." They laughed softly. Then, more serious, she said, "You know, Antonio, when this is all over, I hope you'll remember us kindly." He turned to her. "How could I forget? You teach prisoners to dance." She smiled, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "Then maybe we're all learning something together." Back in camp that night, long after the trucks had returned and the fires had burned low, Antonio lay awake. The smell of hay and smoke still clung to his clothes. He thought about freedom, the kind that came not from escape or victory, but from trust, from dignity, from being seen as human. He realized that the war had stolen many things: home, certainty, pride. But here, among these people, he had found something he didn't know he was missing: respect. The next morning, he woke before dawn as usual. The sun broke over the mountains, gilding the snowcaps in gold. Harper was waiting by the corral, coffee in hand. "Mornin', Ricci," he said. "You ready to work?" Antonio nodded. "Always." As they rode out across the thawing fields, the world around them hummed with life. Birds called from the trees, streams gurgled through the meadows, and somewhere far behind them, the faint echo of a fiddle carried on the wind. For Antonio, that sound was no longer foreign. It was the sound of belonging, of bridges built without blueprints or borders. It was the music of a freedom that no army could give or take away. He touched the brim of his borrowed hat, smiled into the morning light, and whispered to himself in Italian, "Libertà." The word felt right on his tongue. It no longer meant escape. It meant understanding. By the time the leaves began to turn gold on the cottonwoods and the first frost traced silver across the fences, the war in Europe was ending. Rumors had swirled through the camp for weeks: Germany collapsing, Mussolini dead, the Allies marching into cities whose names were whispered like prayers. The Montana air was filled with that strange quiet that comes when the world has held its breath too long. Antonio Ricci heard the news first from Tom Harper. It was early morning, the kind of cold that turned every exhale into smoke. They were loading hay bales onto a wagon when Harper paused, leaning on his pitchfork. "Well, Ricci," he said softly, "looks like it's over." Antonio frowned, not sure he understood. "Over?" Harper nodded. "The war. They say Germany's done. Italy's been free for a while now, but now it's really done. You boys will be going home soon." For a long time, Antonio said nothing. The word home landed heavier than any blow. He stared out across the pasture where the horses stood, their coats glistening in the pale light. Home. What did that even mean now? When the news reached Camp Rimini officially, there were no cheers, no celebrations, just a stunned silence that spread like frost. The men sat on their bunks trying to process the impossible. They were free, and yet the thought of leaving filled them with a sadness none of them expected. The Americans tried to make it easier. Evelyn Harper and a few of the ranch wives baked pies for the men. The colonel in charge of the camp gave a short speech by the flagpole. "You've worked hard. You've kept your honor. Now it's time to go home and rebuild." His voice cracked a little as he said it. In the weeks that followed, the camp became a place of long goodbyes. The prisoners helped pack supplies, mended tools one last time, cleaned the barns as if trying to leave a piece of themselves behind in the order they created. The fences that had once defined their captivity now seemed more like boundaries of belonging. Letters began to arrive from the Red Cross, confirming transport schedules. Most of the Italians would be sent to New York by train, then shipped across the Atlantic to Naples. Every man received a new uniform, a small kit of belongings, and a modest wage for the work they had done. It wasn't much, but it meant something. One afternoon, as the sun sank low behind the mountains, Antonio sat at a wooden table in the barracks, writing his final letter in careful, deliberate strokes. The paper trembled beneath his hand. "Dearest mother," he began, "by the time this letter reaches you, I will be coming home. I'm alive. I'm healthy. And I must tell you something I never believed I would say. The Americans treated us not as enemies, but as men. I came to this country as a prisoner. I leave as a student of its kindness." He paused, staring at the ink as it dried. Around him, the barracks were quiet. Carlo snored softly in the next bunk. Someone outside was singing, an American voice, low and steady. It sounded like a hymn. Antonio continued, "Do not believe the stories they told us in Italy. The people here are not cruel. They are strong, yes, and proud, but their strength comes from decency, not hatred. They work hard. They laugh easily. They trust even those they should not. They showed me that freedom is not something given by a flag or taken by war. It is a way of treating others. If our country learns that lesson, perhaps we will become worthy of peace." When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, sealing it with a piece of twine. The next morning, trucks arrived to take the men to the train depot. The ranchers came to see them off. There were handshakes, clumsy embraces, and quiet tears. Evelyn pressed a small paper-wrapped parcel into Antonio's hand. Inside was a piece of homemade fruitcake and a photograph, a black-and-white snapshot of the barn dance. In the picture, Antonio was mid-laugh, his hand raised as if caught between clapping and waving. "So you don't forget us," she said, her voice thick. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I will never forget." Harper stepped forward, holding something behind his back. "Got a little something for you, partner." He revealed a hat, an old Stetson, worn but clean. "Figured you earned it. Every good ranch hand needs one." Antonio took it slowly, almost reverently. He placed it on his head, the brim shading his eyes. The fit was perfect. "Thank you, Tom." "Don't thank me," Harper said. "You worked hard. You earned your place here." He extended his hand, rough and warm. Antonio took it, gripping it tightly. For a moment, neither spoke. The war, the distance, the politics, all of it seemed to disappear into that handshake. As the trucks rumbled to life, Antonio climbed aboard. The camp gate opened one last time, creaking on its hinges. The convoy rolled forward, leaving behind the barracks, the fences, the stables, and the wide Montana sky. He looked back through the wooden slats until the figures of the ranchers and their families became small dots against the horizon. That night, on the train east, the men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Some sang softly under their breath, others stared out at the passing landscape, where the plains stretched endlessly under a pale moon. Antonio held the photograph in his hands, tracing the edges with his thumb. He thought of the dance, the music, the laughter, the warmth of a world that had shown him mercy when he expected none. Weeks later, after the long journey across the country, the prisoners boarded a ship bound for Naples. The crossing was rough, the sea dark and endless. Yet for Antonio, there was peace in the motion of the waves. Every mile brought him closer to home, and yet he could not shake the feeling that a part of him would always remain in that faraway place where snow met sky and strangers became friends. When the ship finally reached Italy, the sight that greeted them was devastating. Naples was in ruins. The docks were shattered, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and salt. Buildings lay broken, streets gutted by bombs. It was a homecoming wrapped in grief. Antonio stepped onto the shore and looked around, his heart sinking. The city of his childhood was gone, but in its place, amid the rubble, he saw people rebuilding, men hauling bricks, women clearing debris, children laughing in the ruins. Life was stubborn. It refused to die. The Allied officers handed out small care packages to the returning prisoners: soap, canned food, chocolate bars, and pamphlets written in Italian about democracy and reconstruction. Antonio took his package and stared at the logo on the box, the Red Cross, the same symbol he'd seen in Montana. He turned one of the chocolate bars over in his hand and smiled faintly. He could almost hear Harper's voice, teasing him about learning to drink coffee the American way. In the weeks that followed, he found what remained of his family. His mother had survived, though their home had been destroyed. She wept when she saw him, her hands trembling as she traced the lines of his face. "You are thinner," she said. "Maybe," he replied, "but stronger too." At night he told her stories about Montana, about the Harpers, about the dances and the fences and the snow. At first she listened in disbelief. "They let you dance?" she asked. "With Americans?" "Yes," he said softly. "And we laughed. We worked together. They trusted us." She shook her head, unable to imagine it. "You must have been dreaming." "Perhaps," Antonio said, smiling, "but it was a good dream." Word of the Montana experience spread quietly among the returning prisoners. They met in small groups in towns and villages across Italy, sharing memories of ranches, music, and kindness. Many had seen similar treatment in other parts of America: Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska. They spoke of the same paradox. Captured as enemies, they had been taught humanity by their captors. Historians would later write that these men carried home more than rations and memories. They brought ideas about democracy, fairness, and respect. They had seen a society where even a prisoner could earn dignity through work, where authority did not have to humiliate to command. For a nation emerging from dictatorship, those ideas became seeds of change. Years passed, Italy rebuilt. The scars of war faded, though they never truly disappeared. Antonio found work as a stonemason once again, helping repair churches and bridges. His English, learned from Harper and Evelyn, made him valuable when the Allied engineers came through. Sometimes he would greet them with a grin and say, "Howdy, partner," and they would laugh, not knowing how deeply those words reached into his heart. In the late 1950s, long after the dust of war had settled, Antonio returned to Montana. He stepped off the train in Helena on a bright summer morning, the air warm and sweet with pine. Camp Rimini was gone now, dismantled years earlier. But the Harpers' ranch still stood, the same barn rising against the horizon. Tom Harper was older, slower on his feet, but his smile hadn't changed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said when he saw Antonio walking up the drive. "If it isn't my Italian hand come back from the dead." Antonio laughed, the sound catching in his throat. They embraced like brothers. Evelyn came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "I told him you'd come back someday," she said, her eyes misting. Inside the house, everything smelled the same: wood smoke, coffee, sunlight on old pine. They talked for hours about the years between then and now. When Antonio showed them the photograph she had given him, the one from the barn dance, Evelyn laughed through her tears. "I remember that night," she said. "You boys couldn't keep time to save your lives." Harper grinned. "But you sure learned to dance." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, they walked out to the old barn. The doors creaked open, the air inside cool and dusty. The lanterns were long gone, the floorboards worn smooth by time, but the ghosts of that night still lingered. Antonio stood in the quiet, listening. For a moment, he swore he could hear it again: the music, the laughter, the rhythm of boots on wood. He closed his eyes and smiled. "It was real," he whispered. Harper clapped him on the shoulder. "Sure was." Before leaving, Antonio took one last photograph with the Harpers, standing in front of the barn with the mountains behind them. This time, he was the one wearing the Stetson. When he returned to Italy, he hung that photograph above his workbench. Beneath it, he carved a small inscription in the wood: "From enemies to friends." In the years that followed, Antonio became known in his town not just as a mason, but as a storyteller. He spoke at schools and gatherings, telling the young people what he had learned, not from books or politics, but from experience. Freedom, he would say, is not about flags. It is about how you treat the person standing beside you. By the time he passed away in the early 1980s, the story of the Montana Italians had become a quiet legend, preserved in local archives and family memories. In Montana, too, the Harpers kept their photograph framed in the hallway. Visitors would ask about it, the line of smiling men in uniforms beside dusty cowboys, and Tom would say, "Those were our boys, the ones who came here as prisoners and left as friends." Sometimes in winter, when the snow fell soft over the plains and the wind howled down from the mountains, he would imagine he could still hear them singing, the faint echo of Italian voices blending with the fiddle's tune, carried on the cold air like a memory that refused to fade. And in that music, part laughter, part longing, the story of what happened at Camp Rimini lived on. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find its rhythm again. A rhythm that sounds a little like boots on a wooden floor, a little like laughter under lantern light, and a little like forgiveness learning how to dance.